we come to that time we call a Bible study. It's very important that we continue to remember the Scriptures, because that really is where we get all the information we need about living the Christian life. So today we're going to look at 3 different Scriptures that inform the theme for our day. And the theme for our day is helping others to see Jesus. So, the first book that we will take a look at is the book of Deuteronomy, which we believe, those of us who have been scholars studying Scriptures for years, was one of the first, if not the first book written in the Bible. It was one of the first discovered under the reign of King Hosea, and in about 700 BC. And so, it's a fundamental book, really. If you are going to read anything in the Old Testament, be sure and pay attention to the book of Deuteronomy, because it really has a lot of the fundamental thoughts about faith in it. Of course, we can't really actually call it the Christian faith per se, because the Christ had not been revealed at that time. But the things that are revealed there are totally in harmony with who the Christ was. So, today we're going to look at the 5th chapter of Deuteronomy, verses 22 through 24. And this book is, I would say, probably 60 or 70% about Moses and his ministry to the people of Israel and all the things that took place when Moses was the leader of the people of Israel. And this passage here today is a famous passage from the 5th chapter, verses 22 through 24. It's that passage where Moses comes down from the mountain with the 2 tablets on which are written what we now call the 10 Commandments. And it's a great scene that is painted there for us by the Scripture writer. But a fundamental idea comes out of that scene that really is even in some ways more important than the 10 Commandments themselves, which of course are very, very important things. But in that scene, we hear these words in which Moses makes it clear to the people of Israel that that day, because of the tablets, they have seen the Lord's glory. Now, in the Old Testament, that's not something that takes place very often, because the understanding was that if you saw the Lord, you would die. Because the Lord was holy. Antimatter, you might call that. And if you got too close to the antimatter, you would be burned up because you were not holy like God was holy. But all of a sudden here, in the book of Deuteronomy, we have this situation in which a man, Moses, receives from God these commandments, and he doesn't die. He's got a glow on his face, but he didn't die. And it gets across the point that it is possible for us to see God in our human life. It really is possible. It's something we can achieve, and it's something that will not kill us, so to speak. So this is an amazing idea that is introduced to us. So I'm going to read to you now the whole section, and then when I'm finished, we'll repeat the English and Spanish together. The words the Lord spoke to all of the assembly at the mountain out of the midst of the fire. And these words he wrote upon 2 tablets of stone, and he gave them to me, Moses. And when you heard this voice while the mountain was burning up with fire, you came to me and you said, Behold, the Lord has shown us his glory today. We have seen God speak to man, and man did not die. Interesting thought, and a great thought for us. Now, the key thought here today is in your program, and we'll read it in English and then Spanish. The Lord has shown us his glory. El Señor nos ha mostrado su gloria. A great thought comes to us from Deuteronomy. Then we move on into the New Testament now, and today I've chosen to look at the letter of Paul to the Corinthians, the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians in this. And in this letter, he introduces a lot of things, but this is in the 15th chapter. And it's here that he makes sure the Corinthian Christians know for a fact. I mean, he says this is a fact. This is not a rumor. This is not a myth. This is not something people made up. Christ rose from the dead. That is what he wanted these people to understand. That the Jesus that they once knew, who has died and been buried, has now rose from the dead into a new life-giving spirit called the Christ. And in his mind, that is absolutely no doubt about it. Now, you know, in the Jewish culture of the time, they had a rule that in order for something to be true, two people had to agree to it and actually swear to it that it was true. And if two people agreed, then it was understood to be a true thing. Well, Paul goes on to say, I got a whole lot more than two people that have seen this resurrected being. And he claims that there's been a lot of folks in his lifetime, including himself, who has experienced this. So let me read to you just this little portion from the 15th chapter of this letter to Corinthians, in which he says to the Corinthians, I want you to know this. The Christ appeared to more than 500 brethren, most of whom are still alive, even though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to his brother James. Then he appeared to all the other apostles. And last of all, to myself, one untimely born, he appeared to me. So the key thought that we want to remember here, we're going to say it now in English and Spanish. He appeared to James and then to me. Say they are me. So the point of this is that this Christ experience is real. People in his time had actually experienced the living Christ being present in their life. Now, there's a key word that is used often when that is said. If someone says, I've seen the Lord, they oftentimes begin it with, behold, I have seen the Lord. And the reason for that was it was understood to be a vision. It was understood to be a spiritual experience. It was understood to be a feeling, an emotion, a presence, a hearing inwardly. It was the reality of an experience of this living presence of Christ in their life, such that they were actually able to have personal relationship with this Spirit of Christ, this person of Christ, living in them through their emotions, their mind, their spirit. It was more than just seeing a person on the street and saying, oh, I saw Jesus walking down the street. It was much more powerful than that. It was an inner experience of a Christ that was forever alive in them. And so this is the point that Paul is making here today about this vision. He's saying that this is something that occurred to many, many people in his time, and it is still occurring to people that he was preaching to. And he goes on a little bit later, we're not reading that part today, but he says, if this didn't happen, then it's really bad and humanity has no hope whatsoever. But because it happened, because people can come to know Christ, which is to say, they can come to know God alive in them, because they can come to know God alive in them, they have the hope of living eternally in this world and in the world to come. Without that, they would have no hope, he says. So the point is then that Corinthians takes what happened in Deuteronomy, in which people begin to realize that people could see God and not die. And it expands it and says, not only can you see God and not die, but God can live in you. Christ can live in you, and you won't die in the sense of a spiritual life. You may die physically, yes, but yet you will still live, you see. And so this idea was expanded by Paul in this letter of 1 Corinthians. And so then we move on to our gospel reading today. And we start off with this one because it is the gospel. So let's all stand together first and let me read the gospel to you. And then we'll sit down and look at it. Hear now the gospel according to John chapter 20, verse 24 through 25. Now Thomas, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus first appeared. So the other disciples said to Thomas, "Behold, we have seen the Lord." But he said, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and unless I put my hand into his side, I will not believe," Thomas said. A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and they had brought Thomas with them. And though the doors were locked, Jesus appeared and came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here in my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe." And then Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." Amen. You may be seated now. The key thought that we have here is that these disciples said to Peter, said to Thomas, and we want to remember that this is what we as Christians are to always say. Let's read it together now. "We have seen the Lord. Hemos visto al Señor." This is our proclamation to the world. We have seen the Lord. So the key thought that we have here today that is important for us to understand is that seeing the Lord is definitely a reality. But to see the Lord, you cannot go that. You cannot try to do away with doubt. That's not how you'll ever see Christ. If you try to do away with doubt, you'll never see Christ. But what you must do is focus instead upon believing you can see the Christ. And if you believe you can see the Christ, you will see the Christ. And especially you will see the Christ when you understand the sufferings of Christ are like the sufferings that you suffer. Why do you think he says to Thomas, "Put your fingers here and put your hand in the side"? That's where the physical suffering was most obvious. And so he was in essence saying to Thomas, "Thomas, I have suffered, I have bled, I have died. Look at how I have suffered. Yet I am alive. Look at how I have suffered. Yet I am alive." You see, and that's what convinced Thomas. He said, if you can suffer those kinds of things and still be alive, then we can suffer anything in this world and still be alive. You see? And that's why Thomas believed. So the gospel reading expands it again, more so than what Paul actually expanded it to. Yeah, it's true that we all have, not we all, but many have seen the Lord, and we see the Lord the way that Paul explained it. But here in this passage from the Gospel of John, we're given this key understanding. And many people try to get rid of their doubts and say, "Oh, I doubt," and they wrestle with their doubts and they try to overcome their doubts. But like Jesus said, stop doubting and believe. You see, it's not about doubting and overcoming your doubts. You'll never be able to have that personal inner experience until you finally decide that this is what you're going to believe, and you believe it, and you begin to see it, and you begin to understand it. As I've said myself many times, in this world, people say, "I'll see it when I believe it." But in the Christian world, we say, "I believe it, and then I see it. I believe it, and then I see it." So then that is the Bible study we have for ourselves here today. But to sum it up, there's three basic thoughts here. One coming from Deuteronomy that says, it is possible for man to know God inwardly and not be burned up and die. It's possible. Absolutely possible. And the second thought is, this contact between human life and divine life has happened. It's happened in the person of Christ, and it's happened in the person of everyone who has ever believed they have seen the risen Lord. It has happened. And in this world, we can say it is a reality like any other reality in this world, that we can advance from being humans to being those beings who know the divine lives in us. You see, that's the second thought that comes from 1 Corinthians. And then, of course, the last thought is that we will see the Lord when we quit worrying about our doubts and start believing in the active Christ that we see in our life, when we see how we've been helped over the years by a force we did not know, when we see how we're being changed inwardly by a spirit we did not know, when we see these things happening, then we should be able to know that this is what we must believe, that Christ has risen and he can live in us. So that then is our Bible study for today.